for those of you who do not know me already, just to tell you a little bit about the Connecticut School Finance Project. I started the Connecticut School Finance Project in 2015 to ensure that Connecticut had a fair and equitable school finance system. We are a nonpartisan, independent policy organization, and we strive to be an accurate source of data and information about school finance. We are not a member-based organization, so you can't join the Connecticut School Finance Project, but we do actively work with communities around the state, as well as nonprofit organizations and other individuals on school funding. And ultimately, it's our aim to help policymakers develop fair, well-thought-out solutions to Connecticut school funding challenges. This just summarizes that. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the FY 18-19 education budget changes. I'm going to start just by looking at total ECS funding. So for fiscal year 2018, that's the fiscal year that we are currently in. It runs from July 1st of 2017 through June 30th of 2018. After the holdbacks, so as some of you know, the budget was signed at the very beginning of November after the legislature passed it at the end of October. There were a number of what's called unallocated lapses in that budget that the governor's office then needed to implement. Part of the unallocated lapse that he implemented was a holdback in education cost sharing funding, which means that unfortunately many of the cities and towns in the state got less funding than they thought they were going to get in the budget. But after we take those holdbacks into consideration, for fiscal year 19 at this point, there should be $1.93 billion in ECS funding distributed. Next year in 2019, again, according to the bipartisan budget that was passed, we are expecting $2.02 billion to be distributed in ECS funding, and that is the amount of funding that needs to be distributed for the new formula to take effect. Notably, that is $88.9 million over this year's levels after we take the holdbacks into account, but fortunately, hopefully, we will continue to see improving revenue numbers, and it will be possible for the legislature to meet the obligation that they have promised. The other thing that I want to note is that this budget does also allow towns to reduce their minimum budget requirement for fiscal years 18 and 19 if they experienced a decrease in ECS funding. I won't talk a lot about that right now, but if people have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. Just to quickly run through a couple of the other significant education grants, some changes in Commissioners Network, the Special Education Excess Cost Grant, the Open Choice Grant, and the Priority School District Grant. And just very quickly, some changes in the other choice program grants. Now, what everyone is most interested in hearing about is what does ECS funding look like? So this year, for fiscal year 18, we have kept those block grants, which we've been doing for the last couple of years, in place. As many of you know, this year's budget was not completed before the start of the fiscal year. The fiscal year was already underway, so it would have been difficult to implement a formula once we were already into the fiscal year. So as a result, the new ECS formula is scheduled to begin at the beginning of fiscal year 19, and for this year, we continue that block grant process. So this year's grants, the fiscal year 18 grants, are based on what districts received in fiscal year 17, which is last year. Non-alliance districts received percentage decreases from their fiscal year 17 grants ranging from 75 to 13%, or non-alliance districts rather. And alliance districts received percentage decreases ranging from 2.3 to 0.12%. So again, ECS has been reduced by a total of $88.9 million over fiscal year 18 after those holdbacks are taken into account. So, the new ECS formula. So, an overview of the new ECS formula. So, this new formula is scheduled to be implemented in fiscal year 19 and then would be phased in over a 10-year period. So, according to the plan that the legislature has paid out, the amount of funding would increase incrementally every year until we reached full funding 10 years from now in 2028. It is estimated that there would need to be an increase of $42.3 million per year between 2020 and 2028 to fully fund that increase of each year. And after we get all of those increases into place, the total increase in ECS funding over that whole period of time would be $380 million. It is a student-based weighted funding formula, which means that it takes the needs of learners into account in distributing aid. It's also important to know that this ECS formula, like past ECS formulas, only applies to our local public school districts. We still have a range of other formulas for our other school types. So all funding formulas essentially have three parts. They have a foundation amount, they have need student weightings, and then they have a base aid ratio, which is what splits what the state needs to pay from what local communities need to pay. So the foundation amount is intended to represent the estimated cost of educating a Connecticut general education student. So that would be a student who does not have any additional learning needs. They're not a special education student, they're not an English learner, they're not from a low-income background. And the foundation amount in this formula is exactly the same as it was in the prior version of the ECS formula, and that amount is $11,525. This formula continues to incorporate the majority of the state's share for special education into the ECS grant amount. Again, that's something I can talk more about if you want, but it does not separate out special education funding from ECS. Although this foundation amount is based on past foundation amounts, it was not separately derived. It does fall within what we determine to be a reasonable range of foundation amounts based on other states when we account for having special education funding including in that foundation. I'm being told I'm going too fast, so I have to slow down. Sorry. I talk about this stuff all the time. So formula weights. There are three need weights in this new formula. So first, there continues to be a low-income student weighting. So the low-income student weighting in this formula is 30%, which is exactly the same as it was in the prior ECS formula. So what this means is that the foundation amount is increased by 30% for every child that lives in a low-income household as determined by their eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. I'm going to skip the second one for a minute. We've also added to the formula an English learner weighting. There was not an English learner weighting in the most recent version of the ECS formula. This formula includes a weight of 15% for English learners. So that means that if a child is identified as a student who's learning English, they receive an additional 15% of the foundation amount for that student. Also new in this formula is a concentrated poverty weight. And what this weight does is it provides additional funding to those districts that serve a high concentration of low-income students. So one of the things that education research shows is that as the concentration of need in a district increases, it isn't sort of a linear increase in resources. Instead, you sort of have a greater spike in resources in those higher need districts because they're serving so many children who have higher needs. So what this formula says is it says if more than 75% of the students in the district are identified as low income, the district receives an additional 5% weighting for every student who is over the 75% threshold. So it basically provides a little bit of additional aid to those districts that serve very high numbers of high need students. So this easily summarizes the prior ECS formula with the new ECS formula. We can see that we've added some of those additional weights here. This calculates out what the total cost of educating a student according to the formula would be for each type of student. So one of the things that it's important to understand is that need weightings add together. So for example, if a student is low income and an English learner, they would receive 30 plus 15 for 45. So the weights add together. It's not an English learner weight or a low income weight. So once you multiply those percentages times the foundation amount, you can see what the per pupil amount for each student would be with those need weightings calculated in. Next, the base aid ratio, everyone's favorite part of the formula. So when we are thinking about the way that the ECS formula works, first we're taking the foundation amount and multiplying it times the need weightings. And what that's giving us is that says at a minimum, this is the total amount of funding that this school district should have based on its enrollment and the needs of the students it serves. Then what we need to do is we need to determine what portion of that total is going to be paid by the state and what portion of that total is going to be paid by local government through local property taxes. And the way that we do that is through the base aid ratio. So the base aid ratio basically takes town wealth into account to determine what that split should look like. And in Connecticut, we look at two different factors in determining a town's base aid ratio. First, we look at the town's property wealth. So we look at how much property wealth does the town have on a per capita basis, and that's measured by something known as the equalized net grand list per capita. And the other factor we use is income wealth. And income wealth is measured by median household income. So in the new formula, we're measuring property wealth at 70% and income wealth at 30%. And the prior formula, that had been different. We had weighted property wealth at 90% and income wealth at 10%. So this has a little bit of a more equitable balance between property and income wealth. This formula also changes the statewide guaranteed wealth level from 1.5 to 1.35, which I'm also not going to go into a lot of detail on here. And it maintains a minimum aid ratio for all districts of 1%, which means that even if the base aid ratio says that a town would get less than 1% of its funding from the state, all towns get some aid, all towns get at least 1%. And for alliance districts, which are districts that have been designated as higher need districts, their minimum aid ratio is 10%, and that's particularly important for a town like Norwalk. Norwalk is both a higher wealth and a higher need community in Connecticut, and without that minimum aid ratio for alliance districts, a community like Norwalk would receive less ECS funding.
Katie, can you just mention briefly how much time was spent between 1.35 and 1.5?
Between 90-10, 50-50, 70-30, yeah. So I explain everything on this slide as if this is all very easy. All of these changes require a very significant amount of negotiation in the legislature. We spent 6 months talking about the 90-10, 70-30, 50-50 base aid ratio split.
And then divide that between 1.5, 1.35.
Yes, and then looking at variations with different threshold factors to see what the outcomes would be. So all of this takes a great deal of work. These numbers may seem like they are easy to arrive at, they are not, and it takes a great deal of time and negotiation to get this to a place that everybody is comfortable with. I'm going to take questions.
Okay, sorry, I just don't know what.
So this new funding formula also introduces something new, which we haven't had in past ECS formulas, to the base aid ratio component. So what we're doing in this formula that we haven't done in the past is we are essentially adding bonus points to the base aid ratio for the highest need communities. So the way that this would work is if your community had a base aid ratio of 60, which would mean that the state should pay 60% of that total foundation budget, right, the enrollment times the student need weighting, and you were in the top tier here, one of the highest need communities in the state, you would get 6 points added to that for a total of 66 points, right? So what it's doing is it is increasing the percentage of that foundation budget that it says that the state should pay. The way that this is determined is through something called the Public Investment Communities Index, which has actually been around since the early 1990s. It's calculated annually by the Office of Policy and Management, and there are a number of different programs that use the Public Investment Communities Index to determine whether or not a city or town is eligible for that program. The Public Investment Communities Index takes 5 things into account, and let's see if I can remember them all. Per capita income, the equalized net grand list per capita, the mill rate, the unemployment rate, and the percentage of children in the community receiving TANF benefits, which is a broad array of programs that replaced cash welfare. So I got all 5. Basically, towns get points based on where they fall in those different scores. Every town has a score. The index goes from 0 to 500. 0 would be the lowest score. 500 would be the highest score. And what this new formula says, that if your score is over 300 points, so those would be among the highest need communities, you're going to get a certain number of additional base aid ratio points depending on where you fall, ranging between 3 and 6. So what this does is it's a way to drive additional dollars to some of the highest need communities in the state that all of which serve very high need students and which also generally have significant concentrations of both adult and child poverty. The phase-in plan. So as I mentioned, this formula is designed to be phased in over a 10-year period. One important thing to note is that if there is an alliance district that would receive a decrease in aid, according to the formula, they are permanently held harmless at fiscal year 17 grant amounts. So basically whatever they got last year in fiscal year 17, they would get forever going forward. The phase-in schedule is that next year, in fiscal year 19, for those towns that would be scheduled to get an increase under the new formula, right? So we calculate, okay, what is a town's grant supposed to be under the new formula by looking at their enrollment, their student need, their town wealth, and we say, okay, this town is supposed to be getting more money under the formula. We take that new amount, we subtract what they got last year, and they get a 4.1% increase. If in the reverse, we calculate the new formula and it says, this town should be getting less aid under this formula than they have been getting, subtract, they'll get 25% of that decrease. For the remaining 9 years of the phase-in, there will be a 10.66% increase in aid for all of those towns that need more aid. So when we add 10.66 times 9 plus 4.1, we get to 100% fully funded grant. On the phase-out side, for those districts that are going to be receiving less aid, they're going to be phased out at a rate of 8.33% a year. Once we get all the way to fiscal year 2028, we will have a fully funded grant amount and everyone will be getting the amount that's calculated. One thing that I want to note is that ECS grants are recalculated every year, right? So, or should be recalculated every year. Districts' enrollments change over time. The number of need students that a community has changes over time. The wealth of a community can change over time. So for example, I could calculate today, based on the current factors, what it says your fully funded grant would be in 2028, but that number is going to be recalculated every year based on the changing needs of your community, and that new number will be taken into account as they're doing this. So we can't say exactly what someone's grant will be in fiscal year 2028 because we don't know what the town is going to look like then. These are the districts that are held harmless. Norwalk is on this list. There are now 33 alliance districts. Formerly, up until this past year, we had 30. Groton, Thompson, and Torrington have been added to the list of alliance districts, so this is just for your reference because it's been updated. Norwalk is and has been an alliance district since the program began. This is just an example of how the phase-in works. We have some tags in the back, so if you want to take a look at this at home. But it just basically shows how the grant amount is calculated going forward. And then for more information, as Senator Duff said, we have a lot more information. On our website, there is a full analysis of this new funding formula, which goes over this in a great level of detail. It provides every town's grant. It provides a great deal of other information. You can find all of it on our website at ctschoolfinance.org. There's a button on there that says FY 18-19 budget, and if you click on that, you'll get all of this information about the funding formulas. You'll also find on there a list of current town-by-town ECS grant amounts for fiscal year 18, including those holdbacks that unfortunately have occurred. Okay.